Good morning TUT students, LCA and guests. Today we're going to discuss how one develops and designs an integrated management plan from a South African context. A management plan is a really good document to have and must be well thought out as it identifies what is important about an area, especially a protected area, its values, and what is hoped to be achieved in the management of the area. That is the objectives, as the means by which the objectives will be achieved, that is the policies and whatever else is needed to bring about this action. Share Screen has invited Mr. Pieter Nel from Northwest Passport to inform a group of Tshwane University of Technology, Nature Conservation, second and third year students on how to develop a strategic integrated management plan. Pieter Nel has a MSc in Wildlife Management from the University of Pretoria and an MBL from UNISA. He started his career in conservation about 32 years ago and has been working as an ecologist, let's just say an amazing ecologist, for the Northwest Parks Board. Piet has been affiliated with TUT since 1993 as a guest lecturer, a moderator, and as a member of our TUT, our department's Nature Conservation Advisory Board. Currently, Piet is the acting head of the Conservation Management Board of the Northwest Parks Board. I would like to welcome Piet and say thank you very much for being our guest speaker today.
Thank you for that introduction, Cheryl, much appreciated. I can just add also that in terms of my experience with management plans, as said, I've been a regional ecologist in the Northwest Parks Board for the past 32 years. And we've been involved with complex parks, with the management of complex parks such as Pilanesberg and Madikwe in the Northwest Province, to other less complex parks like Tshwane Mountain Reserve, Barberspan Bird Sanctuary, and Molopo Nature Reserve. And I've been involved with the development of management plans at all levels, as I say, from these complex parks and with numerous stakeholders and big five animals to simple management plans that we use on game farms. I'm currently acting as the head for conservation services for Northwest Parks Board, and I'm involved in park management at all levels, from a strategic management to operational management. And today's lecture, as has been said, is around the development of management plans for protected areas. And I'm going to be using on my experience that we had during the past 30 odd years and so on in the development of management plans. And I must accentuate also the fact that we will be focusing on a sort of the South African approach to this plan, to this development of these plans, and obviously working within the South African legislation and policy guidelines provided to us. If I can just say then to start off with, yeah, I've been a regional ecologist with Northwest Parks Board for the past about 32 years. And I've been involved with the management of parks such as Pilanesberg and Madikwe, but also some of the smaller parks like Tshwane, Barberspan Bird Sanctuary, and Molopo Nature Reserve in the Kalahari regions. So we've been involved with the development of management plans at all levels, from complex parks with numerous stakeholders, big five, community, CPAs, everybody involved, to very simple plans for game farms, as an example. As I say, I'm currently the acting head for conservation services in the Northwest Parks Board, and I'm involved with park management at all levels, from a strategic level to operational level. And I would like to discuss then today with you the development of management plans, specifically in the South African context, and we will be focusing mostly on the ecological aspects of management plan development. Obviously, the development of a management plan has got a lot of facets that one need to be going into to be able to develop a comprehensive management plan. But I'm primarily going to be focusing on the ecological side of it. So in terms of my the layout of the talk, we're first going to kick off with an introduction, and then I would like to use adaptive management as a framework for the development of management plans. So we'll be going through the conceptualization stage or the situation analysis that we need to do. Then setting the goals and objectives, determining our interventions or management actions, the monitoring side of it, and then evaluating and review, and then repeating the whole cycle again as we learn. In terms of the introduction, it is essential, it is obviously essential in the proper management of protected areas, the management plan process. And historically, management plans has been developed by planning experts at various levels. But now protected areas are much more complex, and it requires integration into its regional context as well. So the neighbors, the regional economy, the municipalities, the district councils, etc., have to become involved with the management of the park and also with the development of the management plan. So we are required to consult with stakeholders at all levels, from government levels, NGOs, right down to the guys staying next to our parks. We need to take them into consideration, and it's not only because of legal requirements, but I think it's also because of practical and benefits that can be brought to the protected area by involving everybody that can actually contribute to the management of the reserve. So yes, it is inquired in terms of the law that we need to need to consult. And why is management plans then necessary? It is obviously leads to much more effective and efficient management. So it's a much more focused approach. There's an improved use of resources, not only in terms of finances, but also in terms of the available infrastructure, our staff. And we all know how these things are becoming more and more limited. There's also a level of accountability. So now people or officials actually have to will be held responsible for certain things that have to be done, and then improve communication between the protected area and its stakeholders. So just on the adaptive management process, and in simple, what it comes down to is that we need to figure out what we want to do, how are we going to do it. We then start doing it, and then we evaluate whether it's working or not. And if it's working, it's fine, we continue that. If it's not working, then we have to relook at it again. So the process then constitutes, first of all, the conceptualization stage, which help us to put the whole thing in perspective. What is possible, what is not possible, what is necessary, what is really not necessary. Then we define our goals or the desired state of the park or the feature that we want to manage. We develop then strategies and interventions to be able to achieve these goals. Then we do a detailed action plan, which is costed in terms of the resources from a financial point of view, from a human resources point of view, from an infrastructure point of view. All of those are then included. We implement, we monitor and evaluate, and after the evaluation, we are back to conceptualization, where we then start applying what we learned, and we review the whole process, and if necessary, we adjust, or we have a look at our goals and or desired state again. In terms of the conceptualization, this is where we want to determine the context within which this protected area will be managed. And it's a lot of information that we need to collect. Now, it's not necessary to collect all the information that you think you need to be able to develop a management plan. There, obviously, one would be identifying gaps in the information or the data, and then you institute programs or projects and so on to collect this data. That can be done through research, through literature search, through monitoring, or whatever the case might be. So there's obviously the basic information that needs to be collected in terms of the size of the area, the location, all those kind of things. Then the biophysical environment, rainfall information, geology, swells, topography, the vegetation, animals in the area, the hydrology, any rivers, streams, dams, boreholes, whatever the case might be. And as I say, as you've collected all this information, then you may have find that there will be some gaps in the information that you need. Those then just need to be identified for the time being, and you will be working on a way of obtaining that information at the earlier or later stage. The next thing is then to evaluate all this data that you've collected. And yeah, I think there's a lot of things that you should be then deriving from this information. There are, as an example, outstanding examples of natural, scenic, geological, ecological, flora, fauna, etc., that you need to be identify. Any of the unique biological attributes, vegetation types or landforms. Then areas that is essential for the protecting of the ecological integrity of the area. For instance, areas that is important for maintaining water flow and water quality. Areas and resources that are vital for local communities. For instance, economical or cultural issues. And then areas and resources which provide essential services to people outside the park. As for an example, a water catchment area. Then any rare and endangered or endemic plant and animal life that you may have that you could encounter in the area. Sensitive, threatened or endangered plants and animals and habitats. And then also resources that is unusually sensitive to human use. And in cultural sites and so on. And within those, then you start identifying the constraints and the opportunities for this protected area. All right, so just down in terms of actual data collection and where one can find some of this information. So geology, the 1 in 250,000 geological maps from the Department of Mineral and Energy, I've always found that very handy. It can be obtained from the Council of Geoscience, and there's a lot of information on that, not only on the geology, but also on the soil. Vegetation maps, I mean, the vegetation map of South Africa also provide a lot of detailed information, and one can get a lot of information out of that, but you can also be able to develop your own map just by delineating landscape features through a satellite map, and the good old Google Earth can help you a lot of that. And then you go and do your field surveys in each of these units that you've identified. And it can be a very complicated Brown-Blanquet kind of survey, or it can be a broad description of the dominant vegetation in that area, and also some measure of the structure of the vegetation. And then you describe your vegetation so that to what it will make sense for you, and it will be helpful for you from a management point of view. And in South Africa, we've got some areas where there's a lot of resources, specifically on the SANBI website, where a lot of information on vegetation, soils, landscapes, etc., can be found. And then it's always helpful to put these things in some spatial representation. And again, a tool like a GPS is a very handy tool for every nature conservator or wildlife manager, not only from a mapping point of view, but also for other management operations. So I think it's essential that everybody should have a GPS. And then you can have very complicated software, ArcGIS or QGIS to use, but I found that Google Earth just help as well, Farm Mapper. And if you don't have access to any of these things, then a simple old topographical map showing all the features and the roads and everything can just be as well. And as Dr. Ogilvie was saying, just with a pencil, you can also spatially represent the various units in your reserve. And it can also be helpful from a management point of view. All right, so then we now more or less got an idea of what is the vegetation looks like, but now we have to start digging in deeper. And we want to find out what is the veld and vegetation condition. And based on this vegetation map, we then do some further field surveys to determine vegetation condition. We want to know in what condition the woody and the herbaceous layers are, and their ability to sustain herbivores. So we work out the carrying capacity of these things, and I think you guys have done a lot of different methodologies on how to work out carrying capacity, usually based on composition and then the quantity of browse or grazing material. You can employ any of those techniques and so on to do that. And then you do this for every vegetation unit, and you work out the amount of browser units that each of the vegetation units can carry, the browser units per hectare or the grazer units per hectare. So now you've got a very good idea of what is the abilities, the condition of your vegetation component. And now we can move on to the next one. Now the next one is around animals or the game on the reserve. And there, obviously, you need to have the species that is there, the numbers that is there, section H data, if that is possible or if it's available. Always very handy to information to have, especially if you want to start identifying trends and possible management interventions. Then obviously good to have some previous game count data if you've got, because game count is not in itself doesn't mean much. You actually have to see it in the context of game counts over a period of time and how the populations are performing. Then from this and using your conversion factors from Meissner or from more recently from Braum-Dekker, you can then determine the stocking rate, and one can then compare of how that compare then with the carrying capacity that you've just worked out for the various units. And that in itself can also tell you a lot of things. Then some other information that you also need to collect is obviously around climate. And one can also dig very deep into what the different type of components that you can be looking at. But the most important ones is usually around the mean annual precipitation and how much it deviates from the average rainfall for that area, so that you can identify your dry and wet seasons or dry and wet cycles. Some important things, especially on a high veld, is also the number of frost days, which can also give you an indication of the kind of species and so on that you would be able to keep in that area. And then also, if you've got access to temperatures, especially in the Kalahari region, there are, in terms of heat waves coming through the area and the mean daily temperatures, that can also explain a lot of issues around the performance of certain species in some areas. And then there is a lot of other information like historical fire scar maps for the area, any water points or artificial water points, and if there was any supplementary feeding done. And then the research data. I think research data is in the area and even in areas similar to the one that you will be managing, or even with species, the species that you will be working, is going to be important data to be able to define that context within which your park will be managed. Now, then all of this information, then you've collected all of it, but now all of it have to be evaluated. First of all, looking at the vegetation, and the important thing here is perhaps to look at the state of the vegetation, and one can do it through condition scoring in relation to veld in the desired condition. So there you can be looking at the ratio of the decreasers and increasers, or the ratio of the perennial to annual plants in the area. And obviously also from a structural point of view, how diverse is the structure, or is the homogeneous piece of vegetation, bush encroach, etc. Then in terms of animals or game, what was the population performance in relation to the goals that you that has been envisaged for those areas? If you also look at the different species, doing a habitat analysis and look at the preferability of that area or the desirability of that area for specific species. And through that, do some sort of a risk assessment so that you are aware of what is the those potential risks of introducing a specific species into an area. And then there are the rare and endangered species. You know, how are they performing? Can their performance be improved through some management interventions, or do we need to relook at them completely? And then rainfall trends, as I say, specifically deviation from the average, and then fire maps to be able to calculate your fire return periods in a specific area. How often that area has been burned? Is it a very frequent burns, or is it the area that's not been burned for 10 or 15 years for the past couple of years? So now you've evaluated all the data, and now with all that information, now you can start looking at defining your goals or your desired state. Now, the strategic goals are the specific objectives and the results to be achieved over a specific period of time. And these goals then drive your priority setting, how your resources are going to be allocated, the budgeting process, how are you going to develop or arrange your capabilities to be able to manage this area according to these goals. And obviously, it is central to the whole planning process. We need to figure out what we want. This is what we want to achieve through management. So it is very important that we spend some time on this and come up with goals that actually make sense and that we can strive towards. So in this process, it can be a very simple process, or it can become very complex. So first of all, you could have an objectives, like a broad statement, and in which you are then breaking down into very specific sub-objectives. And then under those sub-objectives, you then have a measurable target so that you can see whether you're actually moving further away or closer to your target. Now, it is obvious that you need to spend some time on this one. And these things needs to be what we term these SMART goals. They must be very specific. They must be simple and sensible. They must be measurable. It is something that we should be able to measure, as I say, to be able to define whether we are moving closer to them or we are moving further away. It must also not be pie in the sky kind of goals. It must be something that is achievable, that we know that we will be able to achieve. It must be obviously relevant in terms of what you want to do, and it must be time bound. It cannot be an open-ended, perpetual kind of a goal that we are pursuing all the time and so on without an end in sight. So with vegetation management, it can be anything around the state of the vegetation. As I say, we can be looking at the compositional, some limits or objectives that you want to set yourselves around the composition of the vegetation or even the structure of the vegetation. As I said, we had spoken earlier about decreaser / increaser ratio that you want to achieve, or perennial versus your annual species that you want to aim for. In terms of animal management, there is the general plains game. There is a rare and endangered species that you would be looking at. General plains game can be specifically around for the tourism experience, or maybe you want something more specific where you want to harvest them or you want to hunt them, and you want to have certain type of animals or numbers of animals available. In terms of rare and endangered species, you know, we would usually in these cases like to increase their numbers, but there might also be some conservation objectives around that as well. Then what role are the herbivores going to be playing in terms of the sustaining the natural cycles and of an ecosystem, and the same goes with the predators and any other fauna that we might be having in the park, like bird life, raptors, small mammals, etc. And in soil, things like erosion or soil stability, specific objectives that you would be allowing around that, and then other like wetlands or aquatic resources that you would also like to manage or maintain in state. Then the issue of limits of acceptable change or thresholds of potential concern. These are features or tools that is being used for sort of more high-level setting of objectives. And because we could have conflicting objectives in protected areas. As an example, we've got wetland conservation, and we need to merge that with tourism. Tourists has got a lot of specific requirements or needs. They may want to have swimming pools. They are using a lot of water. They would like to have hiking trails, all those kind of things. And protected area management in this case then would rather set then limits of acceptable change for the resource use. And in so doing so, they determine what environmental impacts from the desired social activities are then acceptable. And then they determine what those management action to ensure that these activities remain within the constraints of that limit of acceptable change. And in further, it's also it's very difficult, if not impossible, to set very rigid or inflexible goals and so on for an ecosystem that which is usually very dynamic and ever changing. And so instead of setting these fixed targets, the agencies then measure sustainable resource use against what they term thresholds of potential concern. So you are giving yourself a range of possibilities that allow for ecosystem change brought about by resource use, and it provided then it remains then within that natural limit of variation, and then in itself obviously create a feedback loop between monitoring and management. So the issue of monitoring is very crucial in this whole process as well. Right, then when we finished with setting our goals and objectives, now we move into developing interventions and management options. And please remember, this is how the management plan is then unfolding. We first set our objectives. We are conceptualizing all the issues around the park and what are those things that's playing a role. What are those drivers the possible drivers in the management in the park. Then we are setting our goals and objectives. Now we are moving into the development of those interventions and management options that we can be looking at. So we identify those options to achieve the strategic goals, and it's usually a range of options identified or defined through input by various stakeholders, experts, experience. All of those things would be playing a role, and we define all those options so that we believe can help us to achieve the strategic objective. Now, then we select on the basis of a couple of things. We then select the most appropriate ones. One of those criteria is the likelihood of a positive outcome of the specific option that we've selected. And it can be done through a simple arguing about it or debating it, or it can be much more complex through develop models and working on assumptions, and then working out on what is the likelihood of this option achieving your strategic goal. Then there's obviously things like funding and capacity that is involved as well. How much can we afford? What is going to be the most likely impact of this management option on that goal and also on other goal, and then other management objectives. For instance, if we define that we want to change the vegetation structure of a certain area, we can be doing it through the use of fire. We can be doing it through excluding herbivores in an area and then using fires, but it might take us 15 or 20 years to achieve that desired outcome. Now, the thing is, do we have time in this day and age now that we've got tourists also that we also have to manage and parks that have to generate income? So in doing that, you go through this process of selecting the most appropriate one that would be relevant in terms of the situation you are now, and also in terms of the other objectives that you need to consider. In terms of vegetation management, management objectives would be usually around diversity in structure and composition on a landscape scale, on a population scale, or a community scale, and in an individual level. And the management interventions that we would usually be considered here as things like alien plant control, bush clearing control, fires, veld condition that needs to be maintained at a certain level. And then to be able to do this, that we have to implement a monitoring program. And this monitoring program, again, can be very complex. It can be used through looking at changes in vegetation through satellite imagery, or it can be a simple monitoring program where you go and measure the different components of the vegetation structure that you need to, or composition that you want to look at. In terms of animals or herbivores, you would also be setting yourselves objectives for each of these species. You must actually look at every species individually and see what you want to do with them. So for zebra, we would like to keep them at a certain level. They've got an impact on bulk vegetation. They are very preferred by tourists. They utilize the slopes, so we would like to keep them at a specific level, and these are going to be the objectives for them. Rare and endangered species, so obviously usually here we would like to maximize the population growth, but there might also be some conservation objectives that we want to achieve there. And then the management intervention that we will be employing here, we have to go, as I said earlier, we have to do a habitat analysis and look at the risk of introducing some of these species. We have to work out the stocking plan. And the stocking plan will obviously give us guidance in terms of the species and the number of species that we want to keep. Then we may also have to do some Section H manipulation to achieve certain performance parameters. And we may also have to want to, in a smaller population, manipulate genetic heterozygosity by introducing or removing certain animals. And in the monitoring programs, again, game counts, or enumerating the different species present. That is probably one of our most important ones. And then also additional information can also be collected, like Section 8 surveys. And then we move into a detailed action plan. And the detailed action plan now really prescribes what needs to be done. We have, for instance, as an example here, the implementation of our fire management plan for the park. There's the annual burning plans that have to be done. There's the preparation for the season in terms of equipment and staff and all those kind of things that need to be in place. We have to execute our fire breaks, and then eventually we do the actual burning plan. Our indicators here is a burning plan that needs to be developed by May. The firefighting equipment must be serviced and ready. All staff must be with personal protection equipment. The annual burning plan must be approved by the Ecological Management Committee. The fire scar maps are at the end of the burning plan. The fire scar maps and the fire record sheets must be consolidated. And then these also list the responsibility of the different officials. So the ecologist must make sure that the burning plan is developed by May. The reserve manager must make sure that these other steps are done. And then these are obviously done on an annual basis, and then there's a small budget that's also part of it. And we can do this for everything. We can even do it for the most simple thing, like we would like to do a thorough inventory of the bird life of this nature reserve that we're in charge of. Priority is not very high, but we would like to make sure that all the bird species in the reserve are properly catalogued. So the indicators then are a list of all the bird species in the reserve, and it's verified and endorsed by the TUT Bird Club. That is going to be our indicator to tell us that we have achieved this management action. And that is the responsibility of the reserve manager. And in year 2, he must be attending to that. He or she must be attending to that. So this almost takes us then through the up to the stage where we actually need to go and do something about it. Now we can also, one of the very important management intervention is then the zonation of activities. And the zonation of activities is basically that spatial framework that needs to guide development and activities in the park. And it manages conflicts by separating the conflicting activities It is also based on several factors, like a biodiversity sensitivity values. It looks at the basics, geology, topography, water and drainage, vegetation, and then the tourist opportunities, and then practical requirements of administration and physical constraints, like the location of infrastructure, your electricity, water, etc., where the gates are, the servitudes, and then concessions and land claims that might be in the park already. So then you come up with these zones that you have identified: the special conservation zone, the low use development zone, medium use development zone, and you can even expand that even further to look at even the residential areas and so on. But for each zone, now we identify the zone objective, what we want to achieve with that. What are those characteristics we would like to maintain? What are the visitor activities that we are going to be allowed there, and how the facility is going to be looking at? Is it going to be a tented camp, or can we afford brick and mortar facilities in that area? So, and then you come up with this zonation map, delineating the different zones, and now you know exactly what can be done in each of the areas in your protected area. All right, and then finally we move on to the final stage of monitoring and evaluate. So all these indicators are then monitored: the vegetation, the animals, the water, tourist perceptions, everything. We analyze the data and we compare it with the management objectives. As I say, are we moving closer or further? This must be regarded as a learning process, how the system is performing under different management regimes. And so we are learning through that. And if it's within an acceptable range, we notice these trends and we adjust where it's necessary, but we basically continue in the same vein, moving towards the target. If it's outside the acceptable range already, then we identify those drivers, we adjust and we implement these adjustments. But if we seem to be already out of the acceptable range, we actually need to go back and review our goals and objectives and whether these are in fact achievable or not. And then we are back again at conceptualization. As I say, we've learned more about the system now. We may have identified some information or data gaps, and then we initiate specific monitoring programs. That is where Section H and etc. might be coming in, or specific research projects. And then if necessary, we review our goals and objectives. And then just sort of towards the end, the guidelines for a good management plan. It must be clear and accessible to everyone. It must be concise but also comprehensive, covering everything. It must be accurate and objective and not be just one person's opinion. It must be systematic and logical. It must be acceptable and motivating to all. So, people should at least agree with what we are trying to do here. It must be precise and practical, and it must be focused and effective. So finally, in summary, I think it's important to state that it is a management plan is a living document. We don't need all the information to start with a management plan. And the strength of a good management plan lies in the consultation and stakeholder participation. And it must also be very clear in terms of your objectives, but it can also be refined as you grow familiar with the process and develop a better understanding of the system. I'll say thank you.